Hello everyone. We are going back to the medieval period tonight to explore another wonder of the Middle Ages, the Tower of London. It is a large, atmospheric citadel, a castle, that gives us a direct view of different periods of medieval architecture, starting from the 11th century. And it is particularly famous for its dungeon, its keep, the White Tower. But it is way bigger than that. There are 2 lines of fortifications around it, and a moat that contrast with the surroundings nowadays. The citadel looks anachronistic, in the middle of a large modern metropolis, like a reminder of a long-gone age of the history of England and London. But this castle is way more than a picturesque setting. It was also politically important for centuries, and it served different purposes. From the start, it was also a royal residence. It also served as a prison and received famous inmates, including future Queen Elizabeth I, before she became queen. From the 13th century, it also became the place where the crown jewels of England were kept, and it still is. So this historical monument, this structure, also opens to many periods and events of English history. It is full of anecdotes, and this is what we are going to explore, to discover tonight. So please, make yourself comfortable. All you have to do is relax and enjoy the time travel. Remember that you can also listen to my stories on Spotify or Apple Music or Patreon if you also wish to support this channel and get more of it with downloads or the stories with background sounds or as podcasts. There are links to all of these in the description box and the first comment. And now, off we go. The construction of the Tower of London began in the 11th century, shortly after the Norman conquest of England, as a new king, William I, better known as William the Conqueror, proclaimed himself king in 1066, the start of a 21-year reign. But before this new Norman dynasty seized the throne of England, before the Tower of London was built, what was medieval London like? To discover but also understand it, we need to go back in time almost by another millennium. As you know, England had been part of the Roman Empire, and this Roman period had seen the emergence of Londinium, Roman London, which was initially a new settlement created by the Romans shortly after the invasion on the site of the city of London, that is to say the center of what is now the larger London urban area. Londinium did not immediately become the capital of this new province called Britannia. Initially, the capital of the province had been placed at Colchester in Essex, east of London. But it was moved to Londinium, probably for a large part due to its advantageous location. It was on the Thames River and connected to the sea, but also a little more inland than Colchester, in a more central position. The beginnings were difficult for this Roman London. The settlement was destroyed during the rebellion of the Iceni, an ancient Celtic tribe. These were the ones led by their queen Boudica. The revolt was finally crushed with difficulty. Londinium was rebuilt almost from scratch, and it finally took off by the end of the 1st century AD. It benefited from the pacification of Britannia by the Romans, and it grew a lot, reaching probably more than 30,000 inhabitants by the 2nd century, which was a lot at the time for a Roman city outside of Italy or Greece. Londinium received quite a lot of investment as a regional capital. For example, its basilica was one of the largest built by the Roman Empire, north of the Alps, out of Italy. But this first period of prosperity and expansion was also a peak for London, because the following centuries turned out to be more complicated. There seems to have been a big fire in the 2nd century that was followed by a reconstruction, but archaeology and archives suggest that from the late 2nd century, Londinium tended to stagnate or shrink in size. After the 2nd century, things worsened for the Roman Empire in general, with a big crisis called the 3rd century crisis, and specifically in Great Britain, with attacks coming from Scotland and Ireland, and internal revolts reappearing. A defensive wall was built around the city, a wall that still existed in the medieval period. It lasted more than 1500 years, and small portions of this wall can still be seen in modern London. But with the decline of Roman presence in Great Britain, Londinium also declined, and so much that by the end of the 5th century, it had been completely abandoned. It was now a ghost town with Roman ruins. Great Britain was invaded again, this time by Germanic peoples coming from the continent, who migrated in search of better lands to settle on, or pushed by other peoples in their backs. Several peoples arrived: the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Frisians, starting a period of Anglo-Saxon or Germanic domination in England. England was separated into different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the site of Roman London, now abandoned, was part of the kingdom of the East Saxons, Essex. Several generations passed without a revival, until a new threat appeared: the Norsemen, the Vikings, raiding coastal regions of Great Britain and adventuring ever more inland. The king of the Saxons in the 9th century, Alfred the Great, recreated a settlement behind the Roman walls that had deteriorated but could still provide protection. So an old settlement that existed outside the walls was moved inside, and the memory of this old settlement, of this place, survives in its name today. Aldwych, which is an area of Greater London in the city of Westminster. Aldwych comes from Ildwick, which meant old settlement. From this moment on, in the 9th century, London was never abandoned again. It had been restarted and it redeveloped. The Anglo-Saxon political capital was not London yet. It was in Winchester, southwest of London, but London still gained importance. And by the mid-11th century, the time of the Norman invasion of William the Conqueror, its population is estimated to have been around 18,000, a reasonably large medieval city. From the 11th to the 13th century, London would really take off, benefiting from the unification of England, its new role as a capital, and a more prosperous period overall in Western Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. By 1300, its population reached close to 100,000. It was more than Roman London, and in Europe at the time, few cities were bigger than London. There was only Rome, Venice, Paris or Bruges in Flanders. So that would be the summary of London's rise in the Middle Ages. But let's return to the 11th century and this Norman invasion, because the Tower of London was built in its aftermath. It was intended to be a royal residence. So what happened? Shortly after landing in Great Britain, William the Conqueror, William I, won the Battle of Hastings, which was a decisive victory because it left England without any other Anglo-Saxon force to oppose him. But it didn't mean the country had been conquered yet. It still had to be occupied. A significant Anglo-Saxon garrison survived in London, behind fortifications. The old Roman wall had been repaired, and at the time, in the 11th century, there were very few stone fortifications in Europe. They were very hard to take. So instead of marching straight on London, William travelled around southern England, establishing castles, more than 30, and cutting supply to London. With its thousands of inhabitants, the city could obviously not feed itself. It was demoralized, and the garrison surrendered. William could enter his new capital triumphant, and like he had done in other places, he ordered the creation of new castles in London, 3 in total, including the future Tower of London. Now, when we think about medieval castles, we tend to imagine stone walls, towers, a keep. This corresponds more to castles built in the last 2 or 3 centuries of the Middle Ages. In the 11th century, castles were much smaller and very rarely built in stone, and we would find them very underwhelming. They consisted generally of a big house, a hall, on an artificial hill, also called a moat, surrounded with a wooden palisade, a wooden wall. The house itself was built with timber, and this model of castle is called moat and bailey. The moat is this big pile of earth upon which the hall or the keep was built, because it gave it a better defensive position, and there was a second line of defense, the palisade surrounding the moat. These castles served multiple purposes. They were not just rudimentary fortifications, they were also residences for local lords, bases of operation to conquer or keep in check a region. They were also centers of administration. So it was logical for a lord or a king to establish his residence in one of them. But because the Tower of London would be a royal residence, it deserved special treatment. Around 1078, it is believed, that is to say 12 years after the invasion, the keep was rebuilt in stone. The tower had been built in a place where it benefited from 2 existing defenses. On one side there was the river Thames, and on another side the Roman wall, which made it easier to defend. The rest was probably defended with a timber wall. But the keep, the White Tower, was built in stone. And that's the first element that makes its historical value. It was one of the first medieval stone fortifications in England, and also among the earliest in Europe. The practice existed on the continent for particularly important buildings, and the Normans brought it with them. So that is how the oldest part of the Tower of London was built, over several years, because it was a big work, a big endeavor, starting around 1078. When William died in 1087, he had been king for 21 years, but the stone keep may not have been finished yet, it is uncertain. What we know is that at the time, this keep, the White Tower, was not called the White Tower yet. It got its name in the 13th century, when the building was whitewashed under King Henry III, but we will talk about this later. So by the late 11th century, the Tower of London had become the most remarkable castle in England. Remarkable because it was built in stone, it was a royal residence, it was in the country's capital, and strategically it was a powerful stronghold for the standards of the time. Only a lengthy siege could have captured it. Due to its strategic importance, it was at the center of English politics in the 12th and 13th centuries. The controller of the tower had a good shot at being recognized as king. And I am telling you this because there would be succession issues and civil wars in the 12th and 13th centuries. After the death of Henry I, one of the sons of William I, who had succeeded his brother on the throne of England, and after the death of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, when his brother John Lackland, inherited the throne, civil wars erupted. At the time, in the 12th century, one of the highest positions of power in England, after the king obviously, was that of Constable of the Tower. A medieval constable was the person left in charge of a castle when the lord was away. It was like a governor of the fortress. And this role at the Tower of London was entrusted to high Norman nobles. In the 12th century, the constable of the tower had large powers over the entire city, the city of London. Many of these powers were removed in the late 12th century, when a position of Lord Mayor of London was created. But still, Constable of the Tower remained a very high position, a highly prestigious role that only progressively lost its importance over the centuries. It has not disappeared. There is still today a Constable of the Tower, the most senior appointment at the Tower of London. In a few decades, this position will celebrate its 1000th anniversary. So logically, given its strategic importance, the castle was expanded. The dungeon, the White Tower, remained the same, but the initial wooden palisade was replaced with a new wall by the late 11th century, probably of stone, but this is not completely sure because nothing of it remains. In any case, the fortifications of the Tower of London would not be challenged for a century, until the end of the 12th century, when it would finally be besieged for the first time. Why besieged? Because in the last decade of the 12th century, the King of England was now Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, who is particularly famous for participating in the Third Crusade and fighting in the Holy Land. While on the crusade, Richard left the kingdom to a Lord Chancellor, William Longchamp, another Norman noble, who reinforced the tower, dug a moat around it, and reportedly tried to have the moat filled with water from the Thames. But it seems it never worked and the moat stayed dry. Longchamp was preparing and reinforcing the tower because a conflict was on the horizon. A conflict with Richard's brother, Prince John Lackland, who was in Normandy, that he controlled, but prepared to go to England and seize power there in the absence of his brother. This is how the first siege took place in 1191, with the forces of John Lackland trying to take control of London, and the garrison of the Tower of London, loyal to the Lord Chancellor and, by extension, Richard I, inside the castle. The siege was short, because after 3 days of negotiations, the Lord Chancellor surrendered to John, who became the new controller of the tower and a strong man in England in the absence of his brother. Richard returned from the Holy Land, but was captured on the way and released against a ransom, and he finally retook possession of his lands. But war was raging against the King of France, Philip II, who tried to take back the possessions of the Dukes of Normandy and English kings on the continent. These possessions of the descendants of William the Conqueror had become huge. In the 12th century, there had been an alliance and wedding with the Duchess of Aquitaine, Aliénor, and the dynasty of the kings of England, the Plantagenets, had acquired through this union and diplomacy large parts of the Kingdom of France as their personal possessions. They were also Dukes of Aquitaine and Gascony, the southwest corner of France. They were Dukes of Normandy, that was their historical title, and also Counts of Poitiers, of Anjou, Maine, Nantes. They had Brittany under their influence. So basically the western half of France was under their control. Actually, Richard spent more time in France or even in the Holy Land than in England in his life. He was born in England, in Oxford, but he grew up in Aquitaine, and it is estimated that in his entire life he spent less than 6 months in England. In fact, after his legend as Richard the Lionheart, known to be courageous and pious, had spread in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, some English historians in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries started to attack this historical icon on the grounds that he was not that brilliant as a king. It is true that despite his skills as a commander and its qualities as a person, he left the Plantagenet possessions in a worse state than he found them. And for England, he was almost like a stranger, because he spoke French and Occitan, the language of the southern half of France, but it is unsure he could even speak English, and he barely spent time in the country he was the king of. Leading to another critique, which is that instead of spending time ruling over England, he just took and used the revenues he got from his crown to pay for other personal projects, the crusade, and after that his wars in France. Projects that had nothing to do with England and impoverished the kingdom. Basically, England would have been turned into a cash cow that he would have used to pursue other projects that were not even successful. What to think of these critiques against Richard the Lionheart? Interestingly, these attacks arose with the appearance of a national sentiment in England and later in the UK in general. they did not appear before, because it started to make sense only when England started to see itself as a nation, a historical community with its own history, geography, interests and culture. And this is why modern historians tend to see these critics against Richard the Lionheart as anachronistic. Anachronistic because they are based on the perception that England was a nation. Something that absolutely no one in the 12th century would have thought or said in Europe. There were no national sentiments back then, anywhere across Christendom. There were cultural affinities, common languages, there was religion, Christianity, which was a factor of cultural unity, but there was no sense of a national interest, no sense of belonging to a national community. The position of lord or king came with responsibilities. Kings were supposed to ensure the safety and the prosperity of their subjects. They were supposed to be just and sometimes to dispense justice themselves. And on these grounds, it is fair to say that Richard neglected England. He did. But no one criticized him for taking the resources he could and use them to fund the crusade or the war against his rival, the King of France. This was legitimate at the time. And in fact, he was not criticized for that before the 17th century, 400 years after his death. The earliest signs of a national sentiment we have in England or in France appear during and after the 100 Years' War. That's 200 years after Richard the Lionheart. And they were still very tenuous, fleeting. It would take several centuries more for European states, European kingdoms, to start perceiving themselves as nations. I am telling you all this just to illustrate how easy it is to have an anachronic view, an anachronic understanding of these medieval wars. With our modern view, we tend to see them as wars between countries or nations, when to the belligerents they were not. They were about factions or rulers or lords pushing their interests and using their possessions, counties, duchies, kingdoms, using them financially and humanly to go to war. Richard did it, but not particularly more than any other feudal king would have done. And he didn't really have the choice either. The crusade was a choice, but the war against Philip II of France was not. He was defending himself. The real fault for a medieval king was to lose his authority over his vassals, over the level just under him in the feudal pyramid. And returning to the Tower of London, this is what happened to Richard's successor, John, and that led to a second siege of the tower, this time with John as the controller of the citadel and his barons in revolt as the attackers. Richard I had died in 1199 during a siege in Aquitaine, and John had succeeded his brother on the throne. But royal authority in the early 13th century in England was quickly deteriorating. John was not liked by the nobles. First, for personal reasons, he was apparently not likable or trustworthy, but also for more material, tangible elements. Taxes and troops that were raised to fight the war on the continent against Philip II of France, the military defeats that piled up, so much so that in 1214 many barons of John revolted and marched on London, laying siege to the tower, while King John was outside London. He was at the other big royal residence, the Castle of Windsor. He had to negotiate with the nobility in revolt and grant them a famous document, the Magna Carta, which was a charter of rights, that is to say, a list of rights granted to the nobles that would protect them against the king. They were granted protection from illegal imprisonment, for example. Their taxes were also limited. They would have access to impartial justice. These rights and protections were only for nobles. We are nowhere near modern concepts of individual rights yet, but the Magna Carta is still a very important historical document because it limited the powers of the English kings against the English aristocracy. In all feudal kingdoms, the rivalry or the power games between the kings and their powerful vassals was a problem. The nobles could have their own diplomacy and could ally with foreign powers sometimes. And when they did so, they certainly betrayed their suzerain, their king, but not really their country, because, as we said before, there was no sense of national interest. So many civil wars began when feuds between noble families or revolts of nobles against their king happened. Some kings managed to impose their will to their vassals if they were strong or cunning enough. And this is what Philip II managed to do in France at the beginning of the 13th century. He was victorious, so people would follow him, and he expanded the royal domain with his conquests, because the king was a noble too. He had his own land. The first Capetian kings in France only had the region around Paris as their land, but Philip expanded that royal domain dramatically. A counterexample to this successful model of feudal king is John. He turned out to be unable to control the barons and lost his throne because of it. So in 1214, to have the siege of London lifted, he signed the Magna Carta, but he quickly came back on his words and on the promises of reform he had made. So a complete civil war exploded this time, led by the barons. This conflict is called the First Barons' War. In 1216, John was deposed, and his son, King Henry III, was put on the throne. But that was not the end of these internal rivalries. English history remained tumultuous in the 13th century. The risk of new revolts in England had not disappeared, and for that reason, Henry III and his successor, Edward I, kept expanding the Tower of London to make it stronger, more impressive, and impregnable. The castle was expanded in all directions, except the side giving on the river, obviously, and the citadel began to expand beyond the portion of Roman wall it had initially used. The keep stayed the same, except with the new tradition to whitewash it, as we saw before. Hence the name of White Tower that began under Henry III. It is at this time, along the 13th century, that the fortress reached its current appearance, with the double line of stone walls, the moat around the outer line. So that by the mid-13th century, the tower was still a rather formidable citadel and a symbol of royal power. Which is why it remained a very important political piece, one that the kings had to control. But the nobles in England were still out for more power and independence from the kings, and after decades of tension, a new civil war began. The Second Barons' War that started in 1264. Again, in 1267, the tower was besieged, and all the work done to reinforce it paid off. Despite a large army and siege engines, it resisted, and the nobles retreated. There were more combats, but ultimately the Second Barons' War ended in a royalist victory this time. The tower had played its role by allowing the king to retain control of his capital, so it had had a decisive contribution in this conflict. In the later medieval period, the tower remained important and it was besieged again several times. In 1381, during a peasants' revolt, a large uprising in England that was due to the impoverishment of the country caused by the consequences of the 100 Years' War that had begun several decades earlier, and the consequences of the Black Death, the epidemic that had started in the 1340s, and that had left the countrysides underpopulated, with villages and towns struggling to feed themselves. In the 15th century, during the Wars of the Roses, the tower served again as a fortress. We will return to these events in future episodes. But as you see, the tower remained a focal point in the kingdom, the key to London, and by extension, a necessary asset to fully control England. This destiny for a medieval fortress is rather rare, contrary to what one could imagine. The majority of medieval castles never saw a siege, actually, and when there was one, these sieges were more often than not sorted out with negotiations rather than actual fighting. Besieging a medieval fortress was always possible, but it was long, it was very costly, it was risky too, because diseases could appear among the besiegers, or they could be attacked themselves in the back. So, for the same fortress to be besieged so many times, half a dozen times in the case of the Tower of London, this is a very eventful existence, and it reflects its importance, its historical relevance. Another thing the tower is famous for is to be the house of the crown jewels of England, and then of the United Kingdom. It is unknown exactly when this tradition of keeping the jewels started. It is believed in the 13th century under Henry III, but the year is uncertain. Recently, in the 1990s, the crown jewels were moved to a vault called Jewel House, in what was historically a building of barracks, a building called the Waterloo Block. But the history of the crown jewels at the tower is also a long and eventful one. These jewels are not just actual jewels, crowns or scepters. There are also plenty of precious objects like dishes, cutlery, flatware, ceremonial weapons like swords, decorative objects, robes. The collection today is huge, with thousands and thousands of gemstones mounted on a large range of objects that have a high financial and even more historical value. But this collection had to be rebuilt, really, in the past 3 centuries, because it had setbacks. In the medieval period, it was convenient to keep it at the tower, because it would be safe from theft, and when money had to be raised quickly, it could be pawned, offered as a guarantee for a loan, rather than sold. This treasure, close at hand, gave the king some independence from the aristocracy. And it was understood as something that could be used as collateral for loans, but that should never be sold or lost. Actually, the position of keeper of the jewels was created, and this role, this position, included the duty to grow the collection. There was a budget to buy gold, silver, and gems that would serve to make crowns and symbols of power, scepters, orbs, as well as serving at the same time as a reserve of value. The biggest blow to the collection was dealt in 1649, during the English Revolution. For 11 years, during the English Commonwealth, royalty had been abolished, and England was governed as a republic. The crown jewels no longer had any reason to be. Money was needed, so they were sent to the mint to melt all metals. The gemstones were sold, and most of the collection disappeared like this. So much so that when the monarchy was restored in 1660, the only surviving items were a golden spoon from the 12th century, which is still part of the crown jewels today, and 3 swords. Some other pieces could be retrieved and returned later, but the collection had to be recreated. And it was, because with the expansion of the UK in the 18th and 19th centuries, with the Industrial Revolution, the kingdom saw its economy and its access to gemstones and precious metals boom spectacularly. This prosperity gave the means to restore the wealth of the British crown, and the crown jewels were turned into the magnificent collection they are today. Part of them are on display at the Tower of London at Jewel House. Another thing the tower is famous for is to have been a prison, a royal or state prison. It was not large enough and too prestigious to house common prisoners, but aristocrats would be jailed at the tower. This started in the Middle Ages. But the most famous prisoners of the tower are from the 16th century. They include Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, who was disgraced and later executed. Also Thomas More, an author and statesman who refused to accept Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England and was jailed and later executed for this. There was also Walter Raleigh in the 17th century, a famous explorer, soldier and statesman. He was disgraced by Elizabeth I and imprisoned shortly at the Tower in 1591. And he returned there 27 years later, in 1618, to be executed because he had attacked a Spanish outpost in the Americas in violation of the peace treaty between England and Spain. But the most famous of these inmates, for a short period, was the future Queen Elizabeth I, who was imprisoned for plotting by her sister, Queen Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, the nickname given to her by her Protestant opponents, because she was fiercely Catholic. In the 16th century, the reputation of the Tower of London also began to change, to shift. Until then, during the Middle Ages, it had been seen, on top of being a fortress, as a rather prestigious and luxurious residence. It was a royal residence all the time. And imprisonments in the tower had been for relatively short periods of time, and only for high-profile individuals. and in rather privileged conditions. They were not free, but they were well fed and could even have personnel to attend their needs. In the 16th century, the tastes in terms of residencies changed dramatically with the Renaissance. The military importance of castles declined due to the progress of artillery, and as residencies, castles were now seen as sinister, cold, dark, wet. So the Tower of London lost the favor of the royals, who stopped using it as a residence, replacing it with other residencies in London or outside, like the Castle of Windsor, which was also a medieval castle, also established by William the Conqueror as a Motte and Bailey castle initially, but who was modernized and made more comfortable along the centuries. Apart from keeping crown jewels or prisoners, another role that began in the medieval period for the Tower, starting as early as the reign of John in the 13th century, was to use the Tower as a menagerie, a private zoo. Menageries were precursors to modern zoos. They were generally not public, but they satisfied the curiosity of the rich and powerful who could afford or access them. Their curiosity for exotic or impressive animals. And indeed, starting in the 13th century, the Tower received many animals from far away. 3 leopards lived there around 1235. A bit later, a polar bear that had been offered by the King of Norway. In 1250, the King of France offered an African elephant as gift, and the list went on all along the Middle Ages, with lions, wildcats, hyenas, a brown bear offered by the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The menagerie continued until it was opened to the public in the 18th century. For Londoners who saw it in the 18th century, this was very exciting, their only chance to ever see a tiger or a grizzly bear in their lives. This role of early zoo was ended in 1830, as the London Zoo had recently opened and could welcome animals and the public in better conditions. As you see, with this mounting role as a prison or a menagerie, the Tower was losing its importance as a fortress. By the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, it had completely lost its military importance and had now become an anachronic fortification in the middle of a fastly growing city, a multi-million people world metropolis that did not particularly need a castle anymore. But it had turned into the most visible remain of London's medieval past, a place that over the centuries had accumulated legends, anecdotes, tragedies. Writers contributed to its fame, but at the same time gave it an increasingly grim reputation, as a sinister place for imprisonment and torture or executions. Not that this was entirely false, but the Tower of London was just a medieval castle with a rich history, and this is what made it evocative and attractive to Gothic writers of the 19th century. Like for the Mont Saint-Michel I told you about in the previous episode, the 19th century was the time when efforts of conservation and sometimes reconstruction of historical monuments began. The Tower of London started to be seen and valued as a historical wonder, a treasure, both for its architecture and its history, which had started in the 11th century with the Norman invasion and had followed the history of England for so long. I am also telling you about this castle among other medieval wonders, because the keep, the White Tower, is a very precious and well-preserved 11th century palace. There are not many other palaces of that kind, of that period, that can compare with it in terms of size and unity of style. The White Tower is one, because the Tower of London was a royal residence, because it remained strategically relevant all along the Middle Ages, and so was well maintained, and at the same time fell completely out of favor in the 16th century as a residence, which froze it in time. It was not modernized like other castles such as Windsor, which became more a composite castle with parts from different periods, whereas the Tower of London is still very 11th century for the dungeon, the White Tower, and 12th, 13th centuries for the rest. The inside of the White Tower is still very similar to what maybe William the Conqueror knew, or if not him, his sons, his direct successors. We don't exactly know when the construction ended, as I told you earlier, and we cannot be sure that William the Conqueror saw it finished. This dungeon included 3 different levels, each floor being divided into 3 chambers, with a chapel and 4 towers, one at each angle. We can also see the signs that it was a royal residence and not just a fortress, with different fireplaces to warm it up. There are 4 fireplaces, or latrines, toilets, built into the walls. In the 11th century, in a stone building, these were refinements, luxuries, that were quite uncommon in Northern and Western Europe. In the 19th and even more the 20th century, the opening of the castle to the public made it a popular tourist attraction. It was protected as a World Heritage Site, and is now one of the most visited sites in the UK, surrounded by a city that keeps changing, evolving, whereas the tower reminds of the tumultuous history of medieval London. We have reached the end of our story for tonight. I will be back soon with another one. But in the meantime, you may close your eyes, let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library if you don't feel sleepy yet. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.